Drakengard 2 is a downgrade in some ways and an upgrade in others. The game's attempts to improve on the first entry in the series didn't always work. The combat feels slightly better but still suffers a lot of the same issues that the previous game did. While its combat does have a bit more weight to it, with more variety and interest, it still falls into the same traps that Drakengard fell in. You can clearly tell that the team was trying to respond to criticism that the previous entry received, but in trying to fix these issues, they lost the soul that the first game had. Drakengard 2 ends up being a downgrade in terms of story though. While it might be slightly funner to play than the first game, it doesn't have the same allure that the previous game did. It does try to take some interesting turns with its tale, but a lot of the interesting themes of the previous game are gone here. There aren't the same exciting, fresh, or unique ideas that existed before. Now we have a bit more of a bland fantasy story with a couple new twists. The game overall ends up landing around the same place that Drakengard did for me. An interesting idea with quite a bit of flawed execution. It falls a bit below Drakengard though, because the only thing keeping me around for the previous game was the fact that Yoko Taro's style was all over the thing. This is what I want to talk about today. I want to delve deep into Drakengard 2 and see where it failed and where it flourished. We'll be taking a look at gameplay, story, mechanics, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous video on Drakengard, I would recommend checking that out now, because this game is a direct sequel to that one, and it won't make much sense if you aren't caught up on the story. If you enjoy the video and want to support the channel, you can do so by liking the video and subscribing. This really helps me out as it ensures that I can keep making videos like this in the future. You can also support the channel by subscribing to the Patreon, where I provide early access to my videos, text post updates, and longer versions of my full series retrospectives. You can also follow me on Twitch, where I stream games that I'm not currently reviewing. Spoilers for Drakengard 2. Hey Dad. It's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about Drakengard 2. Drakengard 2 was announced in 2004, with Takamasa Shiba returning as producer. Yoko Taro was not brought back on as director because of two reasons. First, because Yoko Taro was already busy working on another project at the time, and he didn't have the ability to work on the game's sequel. Taro was also pretty outspoken about how much of a disaster the first game's production had been, and had made it clear that he didn't want to work on another one for quite a while. He did pitch the original idea for the sequel, which was a space tale that involved dragons, but it was shot down pretty fast. He was eventually brought onto the project towards the end of development to work on the CGI cutscenes. He ended up having a love-hate relationship with the new director, Akira Yasui. The two had many creative differences and butted heads at times. This probably had something to do with the direction that Yasui wanted to take the series in. He wanted to make Drakengard 2 much more colorful than the previous game. He wanted to make it the opposite of Drakengard. Square Enix had also stepped in and informed the team that they wanted to cut some of the more mature themes from the first game. They wanted to make a more mainstream product that broader audiences could enjoy. They did want to keep some of the darker tones of the first entry, though. They wanted to showcase war and death with this story, and love and hate. The new main character was designed to be able to explore the themes of father and son, and the child overcoming his parent. The team also wanted there to be a slight parallel to Chaim and Angelus from the first game. Noe was also made to be a stereotype of a hero. Some characters were also sharing traits with others from the previous entry. This was to signify that the torch was being passed on to the new guard. Eris, a new character for Drakengard, was designed with heavy inspiration from the character Casca in the popular manga Berserk. One of the main things I noticed while researching the development for Drakengard 2 was that the returning producer, Shiba, was also not interested in a lot of the changes that were being made. It kind of seemed like he was staying in the series to try and direct things as much as he could, but he really couldn't alter too much. Drakengard 2 was released in Japan on June 16th, 2005 as Dragon Dragoon 2. It was then released as Drakengard 2 in North America on February 14th, 2006. A few notes before we get into things. I just want to first point out that I played this game using a PS2 emulator. Specifically, I played Drakengard 2 on the PCSX2 emulator. I had very few issues running this game, barely even a graphical bug here or there. It ran very smooth and was probably even better than the first Drakengard game. The second note that I have is on the structure of this review. As you know, if you've seen the previous video on the first game in the Drakengard series, these games normally have multiple endings. Because of that, I'll first be talking about the game's mechanics, story, and gameplay while running through my first playthrough of the tale. At the end of that section, we'll then be talking about the other endings to Drakengard 2 before wrapping up with my final thoughts on the project. I should also note here that while the game was originally announced as a direct sequel to Drakengard, it technically isn't. The game was originally supposed to follow ending A of Drakengard, where Angelus was made to be the final seal guarding the world. This was eventually retconned, and now Drakengard 2 exists in its own separate timeline. This is sort of a pointless distinction in my mind, but I figured I should at least point it out, considering the game was developed as a sequel to ending A of the first game. Drakengard 2 begins with a narration from our new protagonist, Noe. He talks about the war between the Empire and Union from far before he was born. It is strange because this intro does show footage from multiple of Drakengard's endings. Noe ends his narration with the reveal that this game takes place 18 years after the first. Now, 5 seals hold the Red Dragon, or Angelus, in place. The Knights of the Seal, a new order, has been formed to keep the seals in place. Each seal also has its own guardian, a lieutenant, charged with making sure the seals are not destroyed. Noe himself has been just accepted into the Knights of the Seal. Noe is a little different than others because he was raised by dragons, specifically a blue dragon named Legna. Noe talks to his friend Eris as she wishes him luck in the Royal Duel. She tells us that the Royal Duel is meant to assess the training of the knights in the service. She tells Noe to not embarrass himself in the battle. We then get run through the practice course to get our tutorial for Drakengard 2. This seems as good a time as any to talk about the combat for Drakengard 2. A lot of things have changed since the first entry, but a lot of things have stayed the same. We still have 2 types of combat, ground combat and aerial combat. Ground combat has generally the same function as it did before. As long as we're outside, we can switch between flying our dragon around and burning down enemies, and fighting with our weapons on the ground. We again have many different weapons to choose from, which all change the way that the game is played. In almost every regard, though, Drakengard 2 makes this a bit more complex, adding in a few more mechanics at each turn to spice things up a bit. Each weapon now has its own specific combos that can be done with it, activating special abilities. These can be simple things like rushing forward, or incredibly powerful moves like jumping in the air and clearing out a room. This variety makes things go a lot better, and with the whopping 66 weapons that the game holds, there's a lot of different moves to be found. This also generally keeps us from just doing our normal 4-hit combos and incentivizes the player to think outside the box a bit. Each of these combos is gained by leveling the weapon up. Each weapon has 4 levels, just like in Drakengard. Magic also makes a return in this entry, each type being tied to the weapon that we're currently using. These are generally pretty good, though some weapons do use the same magic as others, so there isn't as much variety. But the magic feels satisfying to use, especially when you can use it to wipe out a whole host of enemies. Taking out a group of monsters with the use of your magic bar is incredibly useful. Drakengard 2 also introduces the charge bar, which works in tandem with your magic. We can do some really powerful stuff with this system, and once we get towards the end of the game, wiping out enemies feels really great. There's also some more depth to the system in terms of the small stuff as well. We can again dodge and guard and down slash in Drakengard 2, but because the enemy design has been buffed up in this entry, these things are actually useful. Guarding an enemy's attack at the right time will allow us to parry, knocking them off balance and giving us time to attack. Certain enemies will guard more, some will move about faster. There's an actual difference between sponges here, so combat has actually become a bit more interesting. We aren't just slashing the same combo over and over again. Also, we can finally move the camera however much we want. This allows us to be able to see more of the battlefield and removes one of the biggest annoyances of the first Drakengard game. Noe can also be leveled up, gaining experience each time he gets a kill. The game tries to go a bit more in the RPG direction by introducing stat points, but there really isn't a ton of gear to be found, so it doesn't seem to matter that much. Changing weapons with Noe can also change the character that he's controlling. We'll gain allies throughout Drakengard 2, just like in the first game, but instead of summoning them a limited amount of times, we can use them as much as we want. They have their own health and magic meters. This allows for some change in combat as well, and each character has their own strengths and weaknesses. Certain characters will deal more damage against magic users, others will deal more damage against monsters. This creates situations where we have to swap out characters when battling new enemies. Again, all of these new features introduce more variety and interest in the combat system. We can also encounter shops out in the world where we can buy weapons and items to use. Our weapon wheel now allows us to use items to either heal ourselves or increase our magic gauge. This is another welcome change because it allows us to be in control of how much health we have. The only way to really heal in the previous game was to collect health orbs, and that could be random. We can also now purchase accessories from shops that will affect our stats slightly. These can increase attack damage, magic damage, physical defense, etc., etc. These didn't seem to do a whole lot until the later game. For the most part, they didn't really seem to matter too much. Overall, the ground combat system has been completely redeveloped. It's much better to play. It has way more depth than Drakengard did. A lot of the problem with the ground combat in Drakengard was the tedium. Here, a lot of that does still exist. Giving us different things to do is fine, but there's still a little tinge of us just running back and forth and killing targets. It's definitely not as bad as the previous game, but it's still not perfect. Flying the dragon during ground combat sections has also gotten a bit better. There aren't nearly as many things that can knock us off our flying beast. There are certain times where we need to get off to defeat certain enemies on the ground, but when we're burning enemies from the sky, it's just a bit better than before. They also seem to have fixed the issues when mounting the dragon. In the first game, you couldn't hop on the dragon too close to any other objects. This didn't always work the best though, and sometimes we'd just have to run around and spam the mount button until it worked. That mostly seems to have gone away, and it's a welcome fix. Aerial combat is something that I can't say is greatly improved or downgraded though. It's honestly mostly the same. We fly around in the sky and attack enemies, either firing at them manually or by locking onto targets. Drakengard 2 adds more special magic attacks that we can do with our dragon though. This system can be a bit confusing because we keep constantly unlocking these powers, but we can only use them by picking up floating objects while fighting. These objects aren't really that common, or at least they weren't for me, so it wasn't something I really got to use that much. Combat in general has just risen to alright in this entry. It can be fun at some points and entertaining, but it's definitely far from being great or perfect. There's still some issues with both, even with the new mechanics and added complexity. I will say though that it's much less tedious and a bit more enjoyable than the previous entry. During training, we encounter another knight who, through his quarrel with Noe, teaches us more about his situation. Noe is apparently being called a savior by the hierarch, and some people resent him for it. We end up having to fight General Gizmor in the royal duel instead of another knight. This is mostly because he doesn't think that the normal knights will be a match for Noe. After we fight him, he then calls more senior knights to the front. Eris protests this, but Gizmor decides that he needs the challenge. Noe was actually adopted by General Auror, who is now dead. After his duel with the knights, Noe talks to Sire, who is now the hierarch. Sire tells Noe that he reminds him of his father. Noe doesn't like praise, but he especially doesn't like being called the savior. He seems to want to be normal. This could have something to do with the adversity of being raised by dragons. We learn that Verdele was killed around the same time that Auror was, leaving Sire to become hierarch. I will say that the writing overall for Drakengard 2 is pretty bad. There's just so much exposition that's given through dialogue in incredibly unnatural ways. This could have something to do with translation issues, but whatever the problem is, it results in very poor delivery of information throughout the story. This is a notable downgrade from the last entry. Most of the time, the dialogue feels like a bland RPG that was just made to cash in on market trends. They didn't really need to go this route, considering this was a sequel to a mildly successful previous entry. Sirei tells Noe that he has to make sure his father doesn't die in vain. Noe declares that he'll achieve vengeance for his father's death. This is the reason that he became a Knight of the Seal in the first place. Just then, monsters have begun showing up in the district of Shining Life. Eris and Noe are then sent out to deal with the problem. We have to defeat tons of monsters in the sky and on the ground. We get Eris as an ally at this point. Her spears can be good for dealing with tightly grouped enemies in close corridors. Sirei is very concerned about the outcome of the battle at the District of Shining Life. Now monsters are beginning to show up at the gates, a full-out assault beginning on the place. Eris explains the districts to us. There are 5 of them, and they are mostly uninhabitable. These places are protected by the Guardians of the Seal, hoping to keep the destruction of the world at bay. With the reinforcements called, we begin to fight larger enemies. These usually require us to attack their legs and take them down before being able to do significant damage. We end up finding prisoners inside of the district. Eris says that these prisoners are traitors to the Empire, former soldiers that tried to destroy the world. Eris then begins to spit some more exposition at us. In each of the districts, there are keys. These keys seal in the poisonous air in the district. The Shining Life's key is called the Holy Flowers. The Holy Flowers draw on the life force of those around them to clean the air, causing the poison to be neutralized. Noe then realizes that the people that are here are being sacrificed to the Holy Flowers. Eris says that they're martyrs, and it's worth the cost in the end. Noe doesn't like this and thinks that it's immoral to be killing people for something like this. The two then return to the Grand Shrine now that the land has been cleared of beasts. Gizmore says that there have been disturbances in the district of Soulflame. We have to go there with the lieutenant of that district, Zhangpo. Each of the lieutenants seem to be a bit eccentric in their own way. Zhangpo definitely doesn't want to go to the district and clearly doesn't want to do his duty at all. He's also very outspoken and has his own specific style. It's clear that this is the structure that the game was trying to set up, each of these lieutenants having their own personality and character that almost reflects the districts that they protect. We're introduced to Yaha, the guardian of the District of Precious Light, and Haunch, the guardian of the District of Hallowed Water. Gizmore wants us to head forward and clear the way for Zhangpo at once. Legna seems to be pretty outspoken about Noe, taking orders from Eris. He thinks that Noe is above that sort of thing. Legna is clearly set up as Noe's father. The two have a very specific bond, one to protect each other. They care for each other quite a lot, like Angelus and Kayam. Noe doesn't quite agree with Legna, though. He thinks Eris is more experienced and able to give him orders. Legna is disappointed in Noe. Seeing him taking orders and following around someone else like a lapdog doesn't make him happy. I will say that this entry doesn't give us as much of the conversations during battle. It seems like they lessened the Pact-Bearer conversations in Drakengard 2. I felt that these were a pro for the first game because they kept the information flowing. It felt like the first game was very efficient with providing us context and lore. This game doesn't do that as much and puts a lot of that information in cutscenes instead. This tends to draw out the story a bit longer than is necessary and also gives us a exposition dump fatigue. Once we get closer to the district, there's a thick fog about. We find that it's coming from some rocks that are spitting out poisonous fumes. We have to destroy these before it wipes out the nearby soldiers. We have to head to the Soulflame Key, and Noe once again voices his concern that this key is killing the people around it. Eris tells us that the Guardian of Shining Life went missing. There is none currently, which is why we had to protect it before. Zhangpo decides to send some traitors to the Empire inside, which would be a death sentence. Just then we see Mana walk through the crowd and stand as the leader of these people. Mana has clearly grown a lot older since we last saw her in Drakengard. She offers to go inside since she knows some magic. Zhang Po says it's her fault that they have so many martyrs to sacrifice to the key. After Mana journeys inside, the earth begins to quake and the fog has lifted, but Zhang Po seems worried. The group has to head inside to see what Mana did. Eris tells Noe that the reason Zhang Po is a lieutenant is because he entered a pact. We have to make our way through the fire cavern, opening many doors and gaining access to the deeper levels. We eventually reach the flame dais, the key to the district. Mana has clearly established herself as the head of some sort of resistance. Zhang Po tells her that if the keys are broken, the poison in the districts will be released into the world. Drakengard 2's story can be kind of confusing because it uses many terms to describe the same things. It leaves us wondering exactly how the world works. Because of this confusing terminology, combined with the fact that most of the characters' motives are unknown, it leaves us wondering exactly what's happening. It's revealed that Zhang Po's pact has lost him the taste of food. Mana pities him and it bothers Zhang Po. We're then ambushed by traitors and monsters who we have to take out. Zhang Po couldn't stop the flame dais from being destroyed. Mana reached her goal. This frees her and her companions from the district, but she soon falls down, unable to stand. Exposition Eris tells us that when a key is destroyed, the lieutenant is killed with it, meaning Zhang Po is dead. This also means that the Knights of the Seal lose control of this district. The two leave the flame caverns with Mana locked up. The general will decide her fate. Noe seems to empathize with Mana. He realizes that the reason she did what she did was for the people. Eris doesn't want to hear any of this. We have to clear out the rebels from the rest of the ruins. Eventually, Noe talks to Mana and asks her why she broke the key. She thinks that the reason people suffer is because the knights control the districts. She thinks the keys are locks that bind the people to their chains. Eris finds Noe talking to Mana, and it's clear she's upset. Gizmor arrives to deliver the sentence on Mana. Eris gives her the choice of beheading or burning at the stake, and Mana takes the burn. As Mana begins to turn, a huge smoke surrounds her and she's gone, boarded a ship out of the place. Gizmor tells Noe to chase down the ship and get Mana. On the way, he begins to rationalize Mana's actions. Legna just tells Noe that he should ignore the women because they will lead him astray. We hit Mana's ship and it crashes, but she survives and makes her escape once again. We head down on the ground to look for her. We eventually find a secret passageway hidden behind the rocks of the area. We get our first boss fight here against a giant berserking boar. It's a pretty simple boss fight, but it's welcome, considering there were barely any ground boss fights in the previous game. The boar will charge and jump on top of us while spitting out fog. Once we take him down, strange portals appear around the area. These will transport us to different places. This is a small sort of puzzle where we have to find the way forward. Mana tells her rebels to not protect her, to flee with her so they don't have to die for her. The game really tries hard in the first half to make Mana basically the savior of the world and the nicest person ever so that we will want to side with her. Regardless, Mana escaped again. Gizmor sends orders to tell us to withdraw, and we have to listen to him. We then see Gizmor talking about putting a plan into action. When Noe arrives, Gizmor wants to have a drink with him, telling him that it was his father's favorite. Then he clearly turns, telling Noe that his power bothers him. After this, he reveals that he's poisoned Noe, just as he poisoned Auror all those years ago. He did this and is currently trying to kill Noe because he feels that they are fools, and he wants to crush them. It's then that Noe feels a burst of power, briefly taking on a new form and rushing towards Gizmor, stabbing him. Eris walks in at the worst time, realizing she's been betrayed by Noe. Our protagonist then jumps out the window and makes his escape. We then have to get outside before the poison works its way through Noe's veins. Legna comes to give us a ride out of the place. Now that Noe has been labeled a traitor, they've begun to attack him on sight. Noe then goes into hiding, finding a man in a nearby village who needs someone to find the missing merchants that were supposed to arrive. We have to seek them out in a nearby area and rescue them. One huge downside to Drakengard 2 is that it reuses environments a lot. Oftentimes throughout the course of our story, we'll be fighting enemies in what is supposed to be a new area, only to realize that we've definitely been here before. It reuses temples, outside areas, all kinds of places are recycled over and over. It just really feels lazy and removes the illusion that we're actually journeying through this grand fantasy world. We then see a brief scene with a silent man, with a voice calling out his name, Khaim. As we've now journeyed to new lands, Legna's body has begun to change and evolve to the new environment. We eventually return to the place that Noe was raised. He recalls being a child and only having Legna in his life. The two get to share a wholesome moment, father and son. When we find the Forgotten Ruins, truly, Gizmor and Eris are already there. We have to defeat the Knight's ambush. Mana arrives and offers us an opportunity to escape. We barely make it out and Mana becomes our ally. Mana is more of a magic-based character. She can still use her attacks to do physical damage, but her strength lies in her spells. She also deals more damage against magic casters, so she's useful when fighting sorcerers. We follow Mana back to her hideout. She tells Noe that she's going to destroy another key, the one located in the district of Hallowed Water. Noe decides to go with her, only to figure out what's going on and what the truth is. Once we arrive in the district, we find that the river has dried up, forcing all of the people that lived nearby to leave. Once the Knights took the area, it caused the place to become a wasteland. Mana finds a child that has died. She tells the mother that she was too late, but she will destroy the district and help these people. The people that inhabit the desert aren't allowed to leave, either, punished by the Knights if they try, but they die if they stay. This is enough to convince Noe of their cause, and he decides to head with Mana. We end up assaulting the fortress and making our way into the shrine. We find the key inside, whose destruction will cause the water to release back into the land. Just then, Haunch arrives to protect her district. We then have a boss fight with Haunch and her packed beast, Kelpie. Haunch and Kelpie will fly around, attacking us from the sky. We have to damage them in between this. At certain points, magic users will begin to attack us from the ground, so we have to get down to take them out, which really slows down the fight in general. Eventually, we take down the pair. Haunch despairs at her defeat, the life that she lost. The vial is destroyed and the waters begin to flow again. Eris then shows up, convinced that Mana is controlling Noe through spellcraft. Noe only tells her that he can't go back to the Knights of the Seal, that he needs answers. Noe and Mana hear rumors of a masked man nearby. The merchant there wants us to retrieve some weapons for him, though. We have to head into a nearby ruin and grab them. He then gives us the weapons, making the whole trip kind of pointless for him. The two have to head to the city of Rust to learn more before heading to the district of Precious Light. We once more see a scene between Angelus and Khaim, her calling out to him. As we approach the city of Rust, we learn that it was one of the places to escape the destruction of the war between the Empire and the Union. We have to look for the masked man here, contacting informants throughout the city. We eventually find him and he reveals himself to be Uruk, a man that served under Noe's father. Uruk joins our party at this point, becoming a very useful member very quickly. Uruk is used more for crowd control. His base combos will see him swinging his axes around in a great circle, damaging everyone nearby. He also does extra damage to monsters, but he seems to just do a lot more damage in general. Uruk is incredibly powerful, and when I had him in my party, I often just used him in most situations I could because he was so good. Uruk tells us that we have to get out of the city before he can tell the group about the districts. Apparently a one-eyed man is hanging around and he's very powerful. We have to make our way out of the city, and once we reach the gates, the one-eyed man shows himself. It's Khaim, just quite a bit older. This changes something in Mana. She seems afraid suddenly. Uruk says that they can't fight him now. They have to leave. Legna helps the group escape. Apparently, Khaim also killed Noe's father, Auror. He was weakened by the poison that Gizmor gave him, and Khaim snuck in and finished the job. The group decides to head to the district of Precious Light next, even though Mana is acting very strange after seeing Khaim. We have to assault the fortress here, with a huge presence of Empire guards present. We do actually have to solve some puzzles here. These were mostly absent from the first Drakengard. I do think that it makes level design a bit better, requiring us to do things other than just kill targets, but because the levels are mostly very long, it tends to drag the game out a bit more, lending to tedium. We eventually find our way to the Holy Crystal, and Yaha, its guardian, is already protecting it. We then have a boss fight with Yaha, which was the first one that I actually had some difficulty on. Yaha summons a ton of goblins during the first phase. We have to defeat these and every so often track down a tree that's moving underground. Once we defeat all of the goblins, Yaha brings out the real boss, a massive stone golem. The strategy I used here is just to burn it down as fast as possible because it's pretty strong and will kill us very quickly. Yaha is then killed as the key is destroyed. Drakengard 2 does have a slight trend of trying to get us to sympathize with the villains before they die. They begin to tell us a bit about themselves as they begin to perish. This furthers the entire theme that the game has, which is who is really the hero here. We start out as a knight, and we think that the side we're on are the good guys, protecting the world from destruction. We then realize that that protection is actually harming a lot of people, so they must be the bad guys, right? Well, they do have their own rationalizations, and there is some thought-out character here. These people believe what they're doing is right. For the most part, they aren't mindlessly evil villains, other than General Gizmor, who just seems to want to crush fools. We find an informant in the city who tells us that apparently a man who knows about the districts is being chased by the knights. He's hiding out in the closed lands, so we know our next destination. We see another one-sided conversation between Khaim and Angelus, where she tells him that she can see the light. We once again see Eris, who confronts us about the districts. She ambushes us with more knights that we have to defeat. I will say one huge downside to Drakengard 2 is its cutscenes. There are very few scenes that are actually animated. Most are just stills of the character models with this weird blur on them. It seems split down the middle, and it honestly strikes me as a way to save money on the project. It's odd because there doesn't seem to be a logic on when they are used and when they aren't. The whole thing just adds another tally on a list of shortcuts that the game seems to take. We eventually defeat the ambush, but the one-eyed man has arrived. Noe then connects the dots, realizing that he is the one who saved the world 18 years ago. Mana begins to fall into a strange haze. This causes the group to have to escape, leaving Noe's revenge for later. Eris then reveals to Noe that Mana was the one who tried to destroy the world 18 years ago, calling into question her judgment. At this point, we don't know who to trust. We're not sure if Mana is actually using us, and if Eris is right. Regardless, we have to disable the engines on Eris's ship. It crashes and we have to leave. Noe confronts Mana about what happened. Apparently she blocked out the memories, but they're starting to come back to her. At this point, Mana leaves the party, not understanding her purpose or motive in this world anymore. Noe is incredibly confused, but Uruk just tells him to come with him to the District of Shining Life and say to hell with it. This seems like a trend in the story. Noe never really has a reason to do anything. He just does it because everyone else is telling him to. This could be the goal of the writing team, wanting to make him the stereotypical hero, but it just seems really tropey to me. At the district, we have to destroy some pylons that are guarding the place. We then see Khaim, who has captured Mana. He pushes her aside, and it seems Khaim and Uruk have a grudge to settle. Soldiers have taken Mana, though, and we have to save her, leaving the two to fight each other. By the time we cut through the soldiers, Mana is already gone, taken away by the Empire. Uruk says that he lost track of Khaim. We track Mana back to the Grand Hall to find that General Gizmor has taken her. We have to cut through scores of Empire guards before reaching her. General Gizmor is ready to fight. He intends to kill the group and take Uruk captive, torturing him. We can't let this happen, though. Noe has to get his revenge. We have to fight Gizmor here, and the boss battle is actually incredibly difficult. That is, if we don't have a specific sword. If we use Auror's Lion Blade in this battle, then it will deal extra damage against Gizmor, making this battle much easier. With that, it's actually not that hard of a fight. Gizmor makes all kinds of big sweeping attacks, dashes, and sends swirling blades at us. Timing our guards and dodges, though, will keep us from taking too much damage, and when Gizmor is open, we can strike. We don't actually kill Gizmor though. He gets away and heads for Mana. We have to save her, but we only have so much time, so we have to rush through hordes of guards, ignoring them and making for the main goal. Eventually, we find her in the dungeons below, and she apologizes to Noe. Noe doesn't take this apology. He believes in Mana now, and it's not necessary. Because the District of Shining Life doesn't have its guardian, the group decides to head there next. When we get there, we are forced to use every member of our team to take out those who stand in our way. Once we arrive at the life dais, Kayam is already there. He has a bone to pick with Uruk, though, so he tells the group to stay back. Mana has already figured it out. Uruk is the lieutenant, the guardian of this district. Uruk calls himself a coward for this. He was defeated by Kayam 3 years ago, and Auror saved him, but Uruk ran, leaving Auror behind. Uruk made a pact with the land's reaper, and in turn, he'll never die. But this means that if the key is destroyed, Uruk will die. Uruk tells Noe the only way he can truly die is if he's killed when the reaper enters his body to resurrect him. It's a little confusing, but it kind of makes sense. Noe doesn't want Uruk to die, but this is the only way. We then have to fight Kayam. This fight is ridiculously hard. Kayam does so much damage, and a lot of his attacks are incredibly hard to avoid because he's just so fast. It's really hard to get some breathing room here, but just like the last boss, if we have a specific weapon, we can do extra damage to Kayam and make this battle go faster. This weapon is Inuart's longsword, clearly a reference to Drakengard. The only problem with this was I had missed this longsword during my first playthrough. It's an optional weapon that can be found in a chest. There's also no way to go back to previous verses in Drakengard 2, unlike the first game. Because of this, I was kind of screwed. I just had to brute force my way through this battle. Eventually, we best Kayam. He goes to attack Noe, but Uruk jumps in the way. Kayam looms over our hero, but turns his attention to Uruk again, who has the Reaper inside of him. He slays the Guardian, destroying the key and casting the Reaper out, but Uruk pushes Kayam off the edge of the dais. As Uruk lays dying in Noe's arms, he begs him to stay. Uruk says he's lived long enough, and says that he'll see Auror in the afterlife. The holy flowers begin to burn, and with that, the life dais is destroyed. With one district left, the two have to head to it, but they're not sure where it is. They only know its name, the District of Heavenly Time. Outside, Mana tells Legna what happened. The dragon has a characteristically blunt response to Uruk's death. Legna has received a message regarding the location of the last district, so the group heads there. Before we head there, we see some guards witnessing the awakening of Angelus. We have to destroy the barrier around the district, after which we crash land on a battlefield full of soldiers. We have to cut through the crowds, slaying everyone in our path. We eventually arrive at Heaven's clock tower. Gizmor is there, considering this is the final stand, with the last district just beyond him. Eris is also with him, confronting Noe once again about his betrayal. But Noe questions her. He doesn't think she thought all of this through. Before he can convince her, though, Gizmor casts her aside. Noe fights Gizmor once more, but he casts off his armor, revealing something sinister beneath. Before Noe stabs him, he pulls Eris in front of the blade. Eris realizes the betrayal that Gizmor has cast upon her in this moment. With her dying breath, she tells Noe that the final key is on the top floor of the clock tower. It's called the Holy Sands. Legna takes us up the tower. Once we're inside, we find Sire. He's happy to see Mana, his sister. He reveals this relationship to Noe, who is surprised. Sire then tells Mana that he's not the enemy, and they leave him behind as they head off to destroy the last key. We have to make our way through the time-disturbed halls of the final district. Here, some rooms move slower than others, causing us to have a harder time with battles. Making it through this maze and climbing an absolutely atrocious set of stairs sees us meeting Sire again, who has followed us. He tells the two not to destroy the final key. It has nothing to do with the Knights of the Seal. Mana refuses to listen to what he has to say, though. Inside, Gizmor reveals himself as the guardian of the final key. We have to fight him once again, but things are a little different this time. We can still use a blade, Auror's Falcon Blade, to do more damage to Gizmor, which I did have this time around. Gizmor mainly teleports around the room, causing us to have to dodge his attacks and chase him. If we can get to him quick enough, we can get a few attacks in before he runs away again. This battle actually wasn't that difficult, it was mostly just keeping our distance until the right time. Halfway through the battle, Gizmor reveals that he suffered through the Empire. Noe is confused, wondering why he would take such a tyrannical approach if he had seen the horrors of the world all those years ago. But once again, Gizmor falls back on power being his main goal. We then defeat Gizmor, who is disgusted with Noe. Gizmor says he doesn't care about the world if he can't use it. He then pushes his blade through the hourglass. Gizmor destroys the key, taking away the win from Noe before it was over. Noe rushes out of the tower and barely escapes the black explosion. With the final key destroyed, Angelus has fully reawoken, and she doesn't seem happy. Mana and Noe talk to Sirei on the ground. He tells her that she didn't set the people free by destroying the keys, she freed the final seal. He says the purpose of the sacrifices was to seal Angelus away. The people were martyrs because they kept the world from falling apart. This is where, again, the game toys with the idea of good versus evil. It does really try to break down the boundaries between the good guys and the bad guys. In the beginning, Noe thought he was on the right side because he had joined the Knights of the Seal. The stereotypical knights seemed to be a symbol of justice. But when Mana came along and convinced him otherwise, he realized he might have been living wrong. That sacrificing others in the name of controlling the land probably wasn't a good idea. He then joined her to pursue a rebellious and just cause. Now it seems like there might be no perfect option, and he may have been in the wrong yet again. But Noe decides to seek out the final seal, the red dragon Angelus. We see her already laying waste to the land, lighting everything aflame. The knights are still fighting us though, so we have to take them out with Legna. Finally, Angelus makes an appearance, but we aren't her targets, not yet at least. She doesn't attack, so we have to chase her down with Legna, though she's very fast. The red dragon is speaking, but Legna and Noe seem to think her mind is broken, beyond repair. She's spitting out pure rage, ready to destroy anything that lies in her way. She says that she became the final seal for the sake of him, but she can't remember who it is. We then have to chase down Angelus once more. Legna says that someone is calling to Angelus. He can hear her name. Angelus lands inside of a castle and the group follows suit. The castle turns out to be the one from the beginning of the first game. We have to make our way through this place fighting reanimated suits of armor. When we find Angelus in the courtyard, Kayam is there. Noe tells Kayam about Angelus and that she's been broken. He then realizes that Kayam was trying to wake Angelus the whole time. She thinks she's being used and turns on the group, and Kayam protects Noe. We then have a boss battle with Angelus in the sky. She's pretty difficult to defeat. She's very strong and moves incredibly fast. We have to make sure we stay on her and avoid her myriad of attacks. During the battle, Kayam sends a message to Legna to kill Angelus, that it will be a blessing for both of them. It seems that Kayam has been trying to free Angelus so he could give them both the gift of death. As we defeat Angelus, she calls out to Kayam. She realizes that Kayam was trying to set her free this whole time. Their reunion is welcome, and this is quite the touching moment, seeing the two reunited. But this comes to an end quickly as Angelus is set ablaze, and so is Kayam. We see flashbacks to their moments from the game before. The two fade away into dust as they are given the peace of death. I will say I actually like this moment, and it's probably my favorite part of this entry. It gives these two characters a send-off and lets them have their exit, while trying to pass the story off to the new characters that were introduced. It also just does justice to the characters and allows them to have their peace. After these characters exit the story, Mana has seemed to regress even further, back into the trauma that she experienced as a child. But with the final seal destroyed, the world's end has come. The sky has been broken, and it all comes crumbling down, revealing a wider darkness beyond. Once again, in trying to save the world, the group has pushed it further into madness. Legna reveals that this is the true state of the world. The only way to restore it is with a goddess, one that could reestablish the seal on the world. We have to find Sirei to be able to get information on a goddess that could complete this task. Inside the Grand Hall, we have to contend with the spirits of the soldiers there. Mana has again begun to regress further, barely able to speak as an adult. We have to journey to an ancient tomb to find a power that can both save Mana and the world. Legna doesn't exactly want to do this because he thinks that the girl only slows the two down. We venture to the tomb regardless. This tomb holds the knowledge of the holy dragons, and that might be what we need to persevere. This tomb is in the sky, and it's possible that Sirey is already here. Once we reach the place, we have to fight the holy dragons surrounding it. Inside, the structure is unlike anything we've seen. Legna is happy to be home, to be in the place of his people. Inside, we hear a voice delivering a strange prophecy, or possibly history, or maybe both intertwined. Noe doesn't seem to understand any of this, though, as Legna tries to tell him that the prophecy talks about him. We have to stop the turning rings on this massive structure. At the center of the tomb, Legna says that Noe will learn the truth. The dragons and the gods are at war without end. It's revealed that the dragons created humans from the gods, but from the wars will come a new breed, and this will cause the dragons to rise against the gods. The bone casket, a weapon, will awaken something in the new breed. The new breed is Noe, a prophesied savior. With the truth revealed, Legna and Noe escape as the tomb begins to fall apart. Just then, we see a ship that's being attacked by dragons. Noe wants to help them, so we have to defeat the dragons attacking them. The ship crashes outside the tomb. Noe and Mana approach to realize that Eris was on board. Sirey nursed Eris back to life, and she's not ready to die yet. Sirey said there was something he must do, so he's not with Eris. As she and Noe have their reunion, though, Mana begins acting strange, the corruption taking her over once again. We somehow journey into Mana's mind at this point. She sees her past, remembering what happened before. We have to fight Mana here, her child self from the first game. There are tons of her, but we have to focus on one. They'll all attack us though, and dealing damage while staving off their attacks can be pretty difficult. With this, we save Mana and her mind seems to not be broken anymore. Eris then tells us that we must take her to the Promised Land. This was the place where the world was created. Sirey is there trying to seal the world once again, restoring order. Sirey has supposedly already found a goddess. Once we get there, though, Legna has had enough of the group's games. He doesn't want to seal the world. He wants to take Noe to the relic to unlock his true potential. Noe decides not to follow Legna and to try and restore order to the world. Legna then calls forth his brothers, the holy dragons, and they begin to wage war against an army of mechanical giants. Sirey then arrives with Gollum. He tells the group that the dragons are trying to overthrow the gods. They would create a new world even worse than this one. Legna didn't want to save humans from the beginning. He wanted to achieve his own goals. Legna then attacks the group, sending them into the pit below. We see the bone casket, which is actually a seed of resurrection. Legna wants to use it to turn Noe into a soldier to take down the gods. We then have to rush toward Legna as he fires massive projectiles at us. We only have to hit him once to stop the fight, but it can be a trying task to get there. Once we do this, Legna leaves and Mana rushes to Noe's side. Noe then tells Mana that he wants to save her. That is his destiny, and why people called him a savior all this time. He then reveals his true power, which is new to him, the new breed. Legna tells him that he was awoken. This is the power in his blood. He wants Noe to rise against the gods with him, but Noe doesn't want to do this. He begs Legna to not turn on him. He doesn't want to fight his own father, but the two have to battle it out. This is our final boss battle, which is actually really awkward and weird. Flying around as Noe is a little sticky and strange. It feels like a foreign form of movement. We can slash at Legna with our sword, and we basically just have to repeatedly do this until he's dead. The boss fight itself is pretty emotional, though. The entire time, Noe is begging Legna to stop and despairing at the betrayal that he's seen from his own father. When Legna is defeated, he can't understand. The Book of Seeds was wrong. As Legna falls to the earth, Noe thanks him for raising him.
You thank me still? You're a sentimental fool. Just like your father.
Noe tells the group that he's surpassed his father, and Eris steps up as the new goddess, the new seal of the world. This ending, once again being still images, is just another example of the entire project really cutting corners. The ending is quite hopeful though, but Mana yet hopes for something greater beyond this, a better future. The main story of Drakengard 2 as a whole isn't my favorite. As you can tell, it kind of removes a lot of the Yoko Taro weird that was so welcome in the last game. With Drakengard, you could feel a deeper and stranger world lurking beneath the surface. You understood that there were stronger forces at play. During the finale of the game, this is revealed and the ethereal beings begin to show themselves. Hell on Earth, so to speak. Drakengard 2 reduces all of this to a stereotypical JRPG story with some slight surprises and twists. I do enjoy the theme of good versus evil and blurring the lines between the two. I think Taro would do this a lot better in some of the later games, but this one starts to play with that idea. That's probably the strength of this game, but I feel that it doesn't do it as much on an individual level as the previous game did. The last game was incredibly morally gray, and every character had their downside. This game seems to have some winners in the end, some clear saviors of the day, with everyone mostly going home happy. It also devolves a bit into a family drama at the end, which sure has its moments, but it's nowhere near the heights of the original. With that being said, this is only the first ending of Drakengard 2, Ending A. There are 2 additional endings to the Drakengard sequel. These aren't as easily obtained as the original games. Instead of playing certain verses or completing missions in a certain time to unlock new chapters, we now have to replay the entire game again to seek out the next ending. This is incredibly time-consuming, as Drakengard 2 is quite a bit longer than the first game, so it requires a lot of commitment. Regardless, in Ending B, the second path, Noe decides to accept his destiny and use the bone casket. He decides to join forces with Legna and take down the gods. But it doesn't matter, because the bone casket rejects him and we have to battle it. After we defeat the bone casket, Mana realizes her destiny, to serve the gods. She joins with the casket and we have to battle her in the air. As much as Noe doesn't want to, he has to destroy Mana, because she's been fully taken over. Before she dies, it's revealed that she tricked the gods. She sacrificed herself to destroy their weapon. In the end, she saved the world, but this isn't the end, because the battle against the gods has just begun. Noe convinces Eris of their new quest, to take down the Nameless Ones. The two head through the skies to wage war. I actually kind of like this ending more than the original one. It's still a little bit hopeful, but the tragedy lies in Mana's story. Her sacrifice is a pretty large redemption for her character. It also gives Noe and Eris a purpose moving forward. It again serves the theme of blurring the lines between good versus evil. We have no idea if what the dragons are doing is right, and having that line obscured going into the future is fantastic. Ending C is kind of the worst ending. Noe battles both the bone casket, saving Mana, and battles Legna, killing him and overcoming his father while taking on his new power. The gods have been stopped, and so have the dragons, so the world is theirs now. It's kind of the all-around good ending for the story, but a dragon is seen in the sky at the end. Overall, I think the alternate endings were alright for this entry. It feels really tedious to go back and get them, though. I will say that Ending B is probably my favorite of the 3, and probably should have been the original ending of the game. That being said, they're all a bit hopeful, and I feel that there just isn't enough tragedy here to fit with what the original game was trying to do. Drakengard 2 really is a downgrade. It's a devolution from a game that was already not the best. The first game in the series had its problems, sure, but it was still worth venturing through because of the prize deeper within. An interesting story with enticing lore, a cast of morally gray characters, and a world that seemed tragic, unfair, and unyielding. Drakengard 2's story really tones a lot of this down. You can clearly see that the studio was switching from appealing to the artist to appealing to the publisher. They had to make something that could grab a wider audience here. They couldn't return to what they had before because they needed to give people conclusions and service for playing the first game. It feels like most of the soul has been pulled out of the original story and replaced with tropes that we're familiar with. Not to mention the writing is exposition heavy, constantly throwing facts and lists of information in our faces. It just doesn't work, and while there are redeeming factors in the story, it's not enough to make it worth it. Improving the combat of Drakengard was a valiant effort, I will admit. Most of the changes are welcome, but it doesn't go far enough to make this something worth playing. It's still mostly a tedious endeavor. There are some highlight moments when you get a big upgrade or a new cool sword. Even some of the boss battles were challenging enough to be interesting. But all of this is not enough to make up for the drudging through crowds of the same enemies over and over. Top it off with the fact that the game has been lengthened from the previous entry, and we have even more levels of the same thing. There's also the fact that this game just seems like the budget has been massively reduced. Either this was an allocation problem, or the team just didn't get enough money. But half the cutscenes aren't animated well. There's reused environments everywhere. The whole thing is just kind of a mess. Drakengard 2 is an effort, I'll say that for sure, but it doesn't come close to the redeeming qualities that the first game had to keep us interested. It's honestly really not even worth playing, considering it's basically a retconned alternate timeline at this point as well. Drakengard 2 was not well received among critics. It currently sits at a 58 on Metacritic. Most seemed to favor the story and thought it was a good continuation. Others thought it was predictable and bland. Critics also remarked that the graphics were dated even upon release, and even with the changes made to combat, it was the most criticized part of the game. Despite all this, the game seemed to sell decently well, shipping 100,000 copies in its first week. By the end of 2005, it had sold 206,000 units. Square Enix would go on to make the first game in a new spin-off series, but before we visit that entry, we should probably take a look at the final Drakengard game. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.